5 riders appeared on the horizon, cloaked in dust and silence. One of them was the man who had once buried her alive, with his hands, his hate, and his God. But this time, she didn't scream. She didn't beg. She stepped between him and 4 frightened children and said just 3 words. "You're trespassing." What followed wasn't mercy. It wasn't revenge. It was something far more powerful. A woman reclaiming her life, her voice, her worth, and a quiet rancher, broken by his past, who finally chose to fight for someone. Not because he had to, but because he believed in her. This isn't a rescue story. This is a reckoning. This is the day the past came riding back and found 2 people who refused to kneel ever again. The sun was beginning to bleed across the Utah highlands, turning dust into fire and casting long shadows over the broken ridge trail. Thorne Ellis rode in silence, the steady rhythm of hooves and the creak of saddlebags the only company he kept. Behind him, a pack horse plodded along obediently, loaded with flour, nails, and a sack of oats for the mule the girls had named Clementine. He didn't ride for the view. He didn't ride for peace. He rode because chores didn't wait, not even for grief. It had been 2 years since Mary died, and in that time Thorne had spoken fewer words than most men said in a week. The silence suited him. It kept the ghost quiet. She'd died fast. Too fast. One moment cradling her belly, the next choking on blood and sorrow, and then gone. The baby, too. The preacher said God had his reasons. The council said it was Mary's fault for not confessing early labor pains. Thorne had said nothing, just buried her with his bare hands and taught himself to survive with 4 children and no good answers. And now, even on days like this, when the wind cut clean and the road stretched clear, he could still feel the weight of her absence riding beside him. Then something flickered in the corner of his eye. He reined in the horse, halfway down a slope, nestled in a cradle of sand. Something shimmered, wet, not metallic, organic, strange. He squinted. Eyes, he stiffened. His hand slid to his revolver. Bandits sometimes used women as bait, left them bruised, begging in the dirt to lure men like him into ambushes. He circled wide, gun drawn, boots crunching dry stone. "Show me your hands," he barked. Nothing moved. Then, barely audible, "Don't go." It wasn't a trap voice. It wasn't a scream. It was a whisper with a thread of breath and a soul clinging to it. Thorne cursed under his breath. He could have ridden on. Should have, maybe. But if he did, if he left her now, neck deep in the dirt and despair, he knew he'd never sleep another night again. He holstered the gun, dropped to his knees, and started digging. Bare hands against hot sand, grain by stubborn grain. Not because he was noble, but because something inside him refused to let her die unseen. Marin Oaks drifted in and out of a darkness that felt more like drowning than sleep. She couldn't tell if the man digging her out had been real or just another cruel echo of hope in a long line of illusions. Her body felt detached, floating somewhere above the pain. She heard things, the scrape of fingers through sand, the clink of a belt buckle, a voice, low, strained, saying, "Stay with me." But her mind was elsewhere, back in the dust, in the red sun. In the moment, Silas Beckett looked her in the eye and said, "If God means to spare you, he'll send rain." His voice still rang in her ears. Verses she used to believe in now, wrapped around her like barbed wire. The barren are cursed. The righteous shall cleanse impurity from the land. Each phrase echoed in her skull with the weight of a shovel breaking ground. When her eyes opened again, it was dark. The air was cool. Her body no longer burned. She was wrapped in a thick quilt, heavy, worn, and warm, and a clay cup sat nearby, beads of water clinging to the rim. She reached for it with trembling fingers. The world no longer spun. She wasn't in a hole. She was inside a shed. She was safe? In the days that followed, she remained quiet, watching more than speaking. The shed was dry, clean, stocked with simple things. A cot, a basin, a small window that let in morning light. Someone brought her bread and broth. She never saw him come or go, but she knew it was the man, the one who dug her out. And then came the children. Elsie and May, no older than 7, peeked in through the door one afternoon. One of them left a wildflower on the shelf. The next day, they returned with questions. Do you know any stories? Are you a real person or a ghost? Marin smiled, the corners of her lips cracking. She told them a tale about a fox who stole stars to light a prairie night. Noah, the eldest, never spoke to her directly. He watched from a distance, standing between his sisters in the door with silent, cautious eyes. His gaze wasn't cruel, just protective, guarded. And then there was Willa. The baby's cries shattered the quiet one morning. Marin, acting on instinct alone, began to hum, a soft, broken lullaby. And just like that, the crying stopped. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was something close to hope. The saloon in San Rios buzzed with idle talk, the way it always did in early evening, half-warm whiskey, half-cold gossip. Thorne Ellis stood on the wooden porch outside the general store, waiting for the clerk to finish wrapping the nails and feet he'd requested. He wasn't paying much attention until he heard it, a name quietly spoken but sharp enough to cut through the wind. Marin Oakes. Two men sat on a bench nearby, leaning close like the words themselves were dangerous. She's the one Silas Beckett buried. You remember that? Whole council backed it, said she was cursed for being barren. The other man shook his head. Buried alive. That's what I heard. Left for the buzzards. He leaned in closer. But she lived. Ain't that something? Crawled out or someone pulled her. Either way, she's breathing. Thorne didn't wait to hear more. His hands were already clenched, jaw tight as iron. He left the supplies behind and swung into the saddle. The ride home was a blur of wind, rage, and something deeper. Something coiled in his gut like a rattler ready to strike. He didn't knock when he got back. He stormed through the yard, boots pounding the dirt, and yanked open the shed door with a force that made it slam against the wall. Marin was standing at the wash basin, wringing out cloth diapers, sleeves rolled, eyes wide with shock. "What's your name?" he snapped. She stared at him, breath catching. "Your full name." Her lips parted, trembling slightly. "Marin Oakes," she said softly. A pause. "I was Silas Beckett's wife." The words slammed into Thorne like a fist to the chest. He took a step back, face paling. Silas Beckett. The name was a wound he hadn't touched in years. Beckett, the self-righteous preacher who had stood over Mary, Thorne's wife, as she wept in labor, who declared her cursed when their child was born still, who led the council to shame her, excommunicate her, leave her bleeding and alone. 2 days later, she died in Thorne's arms. Now the woman standing in his shed was tied to that man, had lived under his roof, worn his name. "You're his wife," Thorne growled, the words like ash in his throat. Marin nodded barely. "I didn't know. I swear it. I didn't know what he'd done, what he was." His voice dropped to a whisper, jagged and cold. "Get out." She froze. "Please." But he didn't answer. He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. That night the ranch was quiet, but it didn't feel peaceful. The fire in the hearth burned low. The children were asleep. The wind scratched at the windows like a memory trying to get back inside. Thorne sat on the porch, shoulders hunched, a silver locket cradled in his hand. He hadn't opened it in over a year, but now he did. Inside, a lock of Mary's hair, curled and fragile, and a folded note in her handwriting, yellowed with time. "If I don't return, don't raise them angry." Through the window he could see Marin, cradling Willa, rocking gently, humming, just like Mary used to. His throat tightened. She was the wife of the man who ruined his world. But tonight, she was just a woman holding his daughter like something sacred. And for the first time, he didn't know whether to hold on to his grief or finally let it go. Marin Oakes asked for nothing. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She didn't linger in the house longer than necessary. And yet each day the ranch bore more and more of her quiet fingerprints. She mended the torn cuffs on Noah's work shirt without being asked. She swept the kitchen floor before dawn and left the ashes neatly piled outside the hearth. When the stew ran low, she refilled the pot with what she could find: wild carrots, beans, bits of salted beef. The children noticed, not all at once, but in that way kids do when someone doesn't force themselves in, just stays. One morning, while helping May with her tangled braid, the girl looked up and chirped, "Thanks, Mimi," like it had always been her name. Elsie giggled. Maren paused, hands trembling just a little, but she said nothing. Neither did Thorn, who had passed by the open doorway and heard it. He kept walking, but something in his chest pulled tight, not with fear this time, but with the strange, aching warmth of something beginning. That afternoon he found Maren in the yard, hanging freshly washed linens on the line. "You any good with hammer and nail?" he asked. She blinked, startled. "Not really, but I can try." They walked to the west fence, where a section had collapsed in the last windstorm. Thorn handed her a bucket of nails and a hammer, then demonstrated with a short, solid swing. She tried, missed, tried again, bent the nail. Her face flushed with frustration, but she kept going. On the third try, the nail held firm. A crooked victory, but hers. Then unexpectedly, she laughed. Just once. Soft and low, like she was afraid the sound might break if it traveled too far. Thorn looked up from the post he was setting. "I wasn't born strong," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek with a dusty hand. "I learned it every time someone left me behind." He didn't respond at first, just looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. That evening, they sat by the fire after the children had gone to bed. The room was quiet. The flames crackled softly, casting golden orange over worn floorboards. Maren was darning a pair of socks. Thorn was oiling his old work knife, though it didn't need it. Their hands brushed on the table. Both froze. He looked at her, not with suspicion or guilt this time, but with something searching. "I don't want someone here because they feel they owe me," he said, voice gruff but low. She met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "I'm not here because I'm grateful," she said. "I'm here because I choose to be." He nodded once, slowly, and they sat that way for a long time. Not as strangers, not as wounds walking around in skin, but as survivors, still healing, still standing, and, for the first time, maybe learning how to begin again. It began with a low rumble, hooves beating the earth, steady and cruel. Maren Oakes was in the garden when she heard it. She stood up slowly, wiping her hands on her skirt, heart suddenly thudding in her throat. From the ridge, 5 riders emerged through the dust, their shadows long and sharp under the midday sun. At the front rode Silas Beckett. She knew him by shape before she saw his face, the rigid spine, the self-righteous posture, the cold silence that seemed to follow him like a cloak. Her hands went numb. Her blood turned to ice. He had come to finish what he started. The children were on the porch. Noah holding Willa. Elsie and May, frozen halfway through a game of stick horses. All of them stared wide-eyed at the approaching threat. Maren didn't run. She walked up the steps and stood directly in front of the children, arms stretched to shield them, the wind catching her shawl like wings. The riders pulled to a stop in a rough line, dust swirling around their boots. Silas dismounted first. He looked older than she remembered, but no less dangerous. His white beard caught the light, but his eyes were still the same, flat, fanatical. His voice was cold. "You made quite a home for yourself, Maren. Even picked up some bastards to replace the child you failed to give me." She didn't flinch. "You're trespassing." He smiled slowly. "You forget. You're still my wife. By our laws, you belong to me." Her chin lifted. "I belonged to you the day you buried me. But I walked out of that grave. You don't own me. You never did." Silas's face twisted. He raised his hand and signaled. The men behind him moved, 3 stepping down, 1 drawing a blade. Then from the south pasture, a lone figure charged in. Thorn Ellis rode hard, hat lost to the wind, revolver drawn. He plowed through the riders, his horse kicking up a storm of dust and grit. He dismounted in one fluid motion, stepping between Maren and the men. Blood already soaked his shirt from an earlier wound. "Step back," he warned, voice rough as gravel. "She's not yours, Silas. Not anymore." Silas scoffed. "You'd kill for her?" "I'd die for her," Thorn said. The first man lunged. Thorn fired once, grazing the man's shoulder and sending him sprawling. A second rushed from the side, tackling Thorn to the ground. They rolled in the dirt, fists flying, blood spattering the fence post. The revolver skidded out of reach. Silas advanced toward the porch, past the chaos, toward the children. Marin grabbed the nearest object, an oil lamp still hanging on the porch beam. With both hands, she yanked it free and hurled it. The glass shattered at Silas's feet. Flame and oil exploded upward. He howled, staggering back as fire caught the edge of his coat. But Marin didn't stop. She grabbed the broom from beside the door and charged. She struck him once, hard across the face. Again and again. "You think I'm still yours?" she shouted, her voice raw. "You think I'll kneel again? I am not that girl in the dirt. I am not yours to bury." Blood at the corner of his mouth, Silas stumbled back, hand raised in defense. Two of his men froze. One grabbed his arm, pulling him away. "Let's go," one muttered. "She's not worth it." Silas turned, face bruised and scorched, eyes full of fury. "You'll regret this," he spat. Thorne stood, shovel in hand like a sword. "Go home, Silas," he said through clenched teeth, "and pray she doesn't follow." The riders turned and left, dragging their broken leader with them. The dust settled slowly. Marin collapsed to her knees, breathing hard. Thorne knelt beside her, hand clutching his ribs. "You all right?" he asked, voice low. She nodded. "You?" He gave a tired, crooked smile. "Long enough to see that." From the house, Willa cried softly. Marin rose, wiping blood and soot from her hands. She walked inside, and this time, she walked as someone no one would ever bury again. The wind carried the scent of ash and sweat as it swept across the battered ranch. Broken boards, scorch marks, a trail of blood near the porch where Thorne Ellis had bled into the dirt. But the silence that followed the chaos wasn't empty. It was earned. It was the kind of silence that arrived when the screaming stopped, and everyone was still alive. Marin Oakes knelt for a moment longer, catching her breath beside the shattered oil lamp. Her hands shook, her chest rising and falling like a bellows. Her legs felt like water, but she hadn't cried. Not yet. From inside, Willa wailed, soft, piercing, desperate. And just like that, Marin moved. She stood, half stumbling, half walking, through the porch doorway. Her boots left smears of ash on the floorboards as she crossed the room and lifted the baby into her arms. Willa nestled into her chest instantly, fingers curling in her dress. Behind her, the door creaked as Thorne stepped up to the threshold, leaning against the frame. Blood stained his side, but his eyes didn't waver. He watched her, really watched her, not as a ghost from his past, not as the wife of the man who had ruined his life, but as the woman who had stood between his children and death, as the woman who had walked out of the grave and chose not to run. That night, after the children were asleep, Thorne sat on the porch alone, wrapped in a blanket more for memory than warmth. In his hands was a small, dented silver locket. He hadn't opened it in over a year, but tonight he did. Inside, a lock of Mary's hair curled beside a yellowed note, its edges soft and worn. "If I don't come back, don't raise them angry." He read it 3 times, lips unmoving, heart cracking open like old wood. Through the window behind him, he could hear Marin humming, a lullaby made of breath and healing. The firelight flickered across her face, softening her edges, warming the shadows she still carried. He looked down at the locket one more time, then closed it. He couldn't forget, but maybe, for the first time, he didn't have to carry it alone. Noah had always remembered the way Mama used to sing, not loud like May did when chasing ducks, or warbling like Elsie in the bath. Mama's voice had been soft, low, like wind moving through dry pine. After she died, he couldn't stand lullabies anymore. So the first time he heard Marin humming one in the night, he clenched his eyes shut under the quilt and told himself it wasn't the same, that it wasn't her voice he missed. It was the silence that used to come after. But then Willa started sleeping through the night again, and Elsie stopped crying at dusk. Noah watched from doorways and shadows as Marin swept floors, patched socks, kissed to scraped knees. She never asked for thanks, never asked for trust. And still, he didn't know what to do with her. One morning he found her kneeling beside the cedar chest in the main room. She didn't know he was watching. Her hands had opened it carefully like it might bite her. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, was one of Mama's old handkerchiefs, white, with a pink M stitched in the corner. Maren lifted it to her face, pressed it against her cheek. Noah took a step forward. The board creaked. She looked up, startled. The handkerchief slipped from her fingers. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have." Noah shook his head. "She always let us play with her things," he said, barely above a whisper. "Even the nice ones." Maren gave a sad, small smile. She seemed like someone who understood what mattered. "She did," Noah replied. That evening, he came into the kitchen holding one of the books Mama used to read aloud. Prairie Moonlight. The spine was cracked, the cover frayed. "Can you read this?" he asked quietly, holding it out. Maren blinked, surprised, then nodded. The other children curled on the rug. Noah sat at the table, chin in hand, pretending not to listen. But he heard every word. Maren didn't try to imitate Mary's voice. She read in her own rhythm, soft, steady, sure. Halfway through the chapter, he felt it. The ache. The kind that wasn't about missing anymore, but about remembering. And it didn't hurt as much. That night before bed, as he pulled the quilt over Willa's small body, he turned to Maren and said the words he'd never said to anyone but Mama. "Good night, love you." She didn't say anything at first. Then she knelt beside him. "I love you too, Noah." He didn't cry, but he let her tuck the quilt a little tighter. And for the first time since the grave, the house felt whole again. Spring had come, not with a roar, but with a whisper, the kind of quiet change that slipped in during the night and woke the trees without asking. The fields behind the Ellis Ranch had turned soft with new grass, and the creek that once ran dry now murmured again, clear and persistent. Birds had returned to the trees. The wind no longer screamed. It carried warmth now, and the scent of wildflowers and ash finally blown away. Maren Oakes knelt in the garden beneath the porch steps, fingers buried in the soil. The earth was damp and dark and alive beneath her palms. She was planting mustard seeds one at a time, tiny, nearly weightless things, but powerful. Her mother used to say faith the size of a mustard seed could move mountains. Maren didn't know about that, but she believed in planting things, and staying, and watching what might grow from patience and pain. Behind her, the screen door slapped open. May's voice rang out. "Mama, Willa's chewing on my ribbon again." Maren froze, just for a heartbeat. "Mama." The word floated in the air like a fragile balloon. She looked up. Noah was sitting under the eaves, whittling. He didn't look up. Elsie chased May through the grass. No one corrected the mistake. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake at all. A few minutes later, Thorn came out onto the porch. His limp was healing, but slowly. In his hand were 2 tin mugs, steam rising from both. He handed her one and sat beside her on the porch step. They didn't speak for a while, just sipped tea and watched the sun dip low over the hills, painting everything in gold. Then Thorn said, low and quiet, almost to the wind, "Maybe God didn't forget me after all." Maren didn't look at him when she answered. Maybe he was waiting for us to forgive him first. Thorn gave a quiet nod, and his hand found hers. That night after the children were asleep, Maren stepped outside barefoot, cradling Willa against her chest. The stars above blinked softly in the wide sky. She hummed a lullaby she barely remembered learning, but somehow never forgot. Thorn followed a few steps behind. In his hand, he held the old silver locket, the one he hadn't been able to part with, until now. He stopped in the grass, opened his palm, and let it fall. The wind carried it down into the soil, soft, warm, and ready for something new. What began with a grave became a garden. Some stories don't end with a gunfight or a sunset kiss. Some end with a seed planted in good soil, and 2 broken people deciding not to run anymore. Thorn and Maren's story isn't just about survival, it's about second chances. It's about what happens when you choose to stay, even after the world has tried to bury you, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Maybe you've never been left in the dirt like Maren, but maybe you've been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel like your value depended on what you could give, your labor, your love, your body. And maybe, like Thorn, you've carried grief for so long, it started to feel like part of who you are. In a world that moves faster than ever, where people often walk away instead of working through pain, This story reminds us of something rare. Healing takes time, forgiveness takes courage, and sometimes the quietest acts, planting a garden, rocking a child, choosing to stay, are the ones that change everything. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, especially those of you who've lived long enough to know life doesn't always give us easy choices, but it still offers grace if we're willing to reach for it. Have you ever stayed when it would have been easier to walk away? Can a person truly begin again, or are some ghosts just too heavy? If this story spoke to something in your heart, please consider subscribing to Wild West Love Stories. Each week, we share tales of resilience, redemption, and the kind of quiet strength the world desperately needs more of. Next week, we'll meet a woman who buried her name for 10 years, until a wounded cowboy spoke it aloud again. Thank you for writing with us today, and remember, sometimes what begins in dust ends in bloom.